Welcome to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. It is Tuesday, February 14th. Happy Valentine's Day, committee. I would like to welcome Representative Burrows, who is here to give us a quick intro to her bill H-180, Act relating to standardizing the opening time of polling places. So, Representative Burrows, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me in. For the record, I am Elizabeth Burrows. I represent Windsor 1, which is the towns of Heartland, West Windsor, and Windsor. And I reside in West Windsor. And I think that introduction is probably longer than the bill, which simply says, this bill proposes to standardize the opening time for all polling places in the state of Vermont. All polling places in the state already have a standardized closing time of 7 p.m. And if you look at the signers of the bill, the bill as currently drafted, the people who supported it are totally tripartisan. It's a love it or hate it bill. And I'm asking you to set the time if you should take this up. I don't care what the time is. Although part of the reason for the bill is that there are several, if not many, towns that open well into the morning, which is 10:30, which is really not equitable for working people to be able to vote, especially when the polls close at 7. That's it. That's really it. Are there any questions?
You did say, Elizabeth, they're all at 7 p.m. though. Everybody is 7.
Everybody closes at 7 p.m.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I think the window of opening right now ranges from somewhere, I think 5 a.m. is the earliest. I think Huntington actually opens at 5 a.m. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, and that's the, town. I think Huntington opens at 5 a.m. That's the earliest.
3:30 wake up.
Yeah.
I thought it was 7.
7 a.m. is most of the larger towns. I think that's probably the median. Most towns.
I have 3 towns in my district, and each opens at a different time. And not that you need a bill to correct the mishandling of the times by the Secretary of State's office, but they're often misprinted and different types of information getting out to the public and causing confusion. So that's another aspect of it.
Representative Nugent?
I was just curious, if you'd heard from folks in towns that have different or, kind of unique opening times, if that would be helpful for them.
We had this conversation. We thought, we're the only town that, but one of my towns, the town I live in, doesn't open till 10, and everyone around us is either 7 or 8 a.m. It's 2 hours less voting.
Yeah, our town had the Secretary of State's office put out notice that our town polls opened like 2 hours before they actually did. And so people did persevere and come a second and third time, 3 times in several cases to actually be able to vote. So but it's a simple bill, and it's, not meant to stand on its own.
Well, as you know, we are going to be hearing testimony on, there's a miscellaneous bill we have on the table that we're going to start taking some testimony on in earnest today. And so I appreciate you coming in and sharing this additional idea for consideration. I talked to several of the clerks who are visiting for Vermont Municipal Clerks and Treasurers Association. They were in the card room today, and there's a variety of opinions amongst them. So it'll be
I'm sure
get their feedback if the committee feels like we should take further discussion on H-180.
I will say that I heard from one poll operator who was upset at the idea of being forced to open her polls later than she already does. So it goes both ways.
Interesting. I feel like the simple idea may have sparked a lot of conversation, Representative Burrows. So thanks for bringing this. We're not afraid of tackling the tough issues here in House Government.
That's right.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Really.
Need anything else from me?
Anybody else have any other questions for Representative Burrows?
You can take a chocolate kiss on your way out if you would.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's. All right. So I have invited representatives from the major parties and some other government groups in over the next couple of days. So we first on our list here have Mr. Paul Dame, who's the chair of the Vermont Republican Party. So if you'd like to come and take the witness seat, I'd really appreciate you spending some time with us today. I've asked the folks to give their thoughts in response to the draft miscellaneous elections bill, the 23-0 miscellaneous changes to election laws, and I appreciate you being with us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's kind of fun that some of you know, including Representative Mulricky. I used to be a rep, so it's interesting to be on this side of the table for once. But thanks for the opportunity to weigh in on this. Again, my name is Paul Dame. I am the state chair of the Vermont Republican Party. And I just, there's a lot in here, which I think, is kind of interesting. So I just want to go through some of the main points. The first off, sort of the sore loser law, I think is something that, we don't really have a problem with. What I do notice here is or a way you can sort of enhance this is I think people need to decide up front if they're going to be an independent, if they're going to be a Republican, a progressive, they should pick a lane at the beginning of the process and commit to that lane, at least through that election, right? Next election, they can make a different choice. And so I think even if people win a particular primary, or they still shouldn't have the option to go into another primary or to run as an independent. So I think what I saw missing there was even if you win a party primary, as almost or would have happened if the election laws were different. We had somebody running one of our primaries whose intention was to take that place and eliminate it on the general election ballot and then run as an independent. So I think that you could add to the sore loser law a prohibition on, even if you win the primary, you still shouldn't get to run as an independent. I think that makes it clearer that people are either an independent or they're running in a primary to represent a party. I think it's a good move to line up the filing deadlines. It was always kind of peculiar to me why independents got to file later. Then everybody knows sort of at the beginning of the process in May that these are the candidates that are going to be on the general election ballot, or in the case of primaries, we're eliminating people who don't make it through the primary. One of the concerns I had was on sort of the organizational reporting. Obviously a lot of the people who are serve as town chairs, as county chairs, they're doing so in a volunteer capacity. And so I'm a little concerned about putting name, address, phone number information into Secretary of State's office that then becomes publicly searchable without knowing a lot about who's requesting that information, where is it going, does everybody in those town and county organizations know that their information is going to be subject to a public records request? Especially when you consider there are other organizations that are involved in political activity that are not parties, PACs and other things, who have similar people in volunteer capacities, and none of their personal information is getting collected by the Secretary of State. So obviously, the Republican Party is concerned about privacy, and I think this is a place where I don't understand what the public benefit is for names, address, contact info for volunteers on those town committees. On the matter of dual nominations, again, I think what my preference is, my goal is making sure we give voters as much information on the ballot as we can. And so when a candidate decides to run sort of as a fusion candidate or get this dual nomination, they're communicating to the voter or they're communicating to voters in those particular primaries that I have some level of support amongst both of those primaries. I think that Vermonters like people who, like candidates who can cross the line, work across the line. And if we want to encourage that, or at least communicate to voters that we have a candidate who has done that or is making an effort to do that, I think that's a good thing. And I think it reduces some of the, the partisan nature of some of the elections by allowing candidates who are doing that to keep those dual nominations. Let's see, for candidate demographic info, I think I don't, we don't have a problem with that, especially I think the fact that it's listed as being optional, is appropriate. And then another place where I think I have a little more concern is on the certification for write-ins, especially because the deadline is so early. A lot of times people don't realize that there isn't somebody, especially for some of these smaller offices, that there's nobody on the ballot until they get their absentee ballot now. And sometimes we've had folks in races where we weren't able to recruit somebody before the deadline decide that, hey, if nobody else is going to run, I'll throw my name in. And so whenever we put a hurdle in front of any voter who wants to participate in the process, especially if they're sort of not part of the regular and traditional, party apparatus, I think it's a good thing. It's a welcoming thing to allow people to enter into the process, especially as a candidate, and keep that bar as low as possible. So I think allowing the writing candidate to get on and to be counted and be accepted as a potential winner if they meet the requirements is important. But I also think it's important to count those actual votes, right? I think that when people want to vote, when people make a write-in vote, it's one of the most intentional votes that you can possibly make. Right. Some of the least intentional are in other states. They have straight party ticket voting, which you may not even know the names of the people that you voted for. But when a voter decides, I'm going to write somebody's name in, you got to know that person's name, and you got to have a really good reason to do something that's sort of out of the normal. So I can't think of a vote that's more intentional than a write-in vote. And what I see in this bill that's concerning is that we're going to count that vote as less. Right, that name isn't going to show up in the official totals there if that person, if it wasn't an official write-in candidate. So that individual who cast that vote isn't going to really feel like their vote got recorded. And I think in a time where folks are there's greater attention on the election process, having individual write-in votes show up. I understand it's extra work for the town clerks, but I think it gives our voters, the confidence that their vote really does count no matter how sort of outside the mainstream it is. So I think that, we would be for leaving the write-in process the way that it is. I think the 25 minimum, for House races and at various different offices is appropriate, right? You've got to have a threshold to actually get elected. But I think it's important to voters, let them know your vote counts, and we're going to count even the write-ins there. So I think those were the main parts of the bill that I saw. I think while I'm here, I wanted to mention a couple things that I think we're missing. We've had a little bit of discussion in our party about the primary, especially this last year. And one of the things that seems to be missing is really a party is a brand. And we've over time, right, it used to be that the parties would get together in a smoke-filled room and they'd pick people. And if you didn't know the right person, you didn't get on the ballot. And we've moved farther away from that to creating probably one of the most open processes that we have. Because we don't have party registration in Vermont, anybody can run on any ballot. And so if I wanted to, I could run for governor as a Democrat, even though I'm the chair of the Republican Party. And I think there's a case where we've gotten so open that we may need to come back towards the middle and give parties some kind of a mechanism either to restrict people from getting on the ballot, or at least denoting, hey, this is somebody who the people in the party have talked to, is a legitimate and valid candidate. One suggestion is in the state of Connecticut, they allow parties to endorse candidates. While I'm not a big fan of the idea of having a single candidate be endorsed, I think maybe a modification of that would be where you allow the party to maybe have approved candidates. So if you have maybe 4 candidates and there's somebody who, for whatever reasons, don't meet the criteria of the party, we have rules against, that we wouldn't support felons, we wouldn't support other people who've run in primaries and gotten less than a certain percentage before, the people we just think aren't viable or aren't representing, our party. Then we could say, all right, these 3 people are candidates that the state party is amenable to working with. And here's somebody who really doesn't belong on our ballot. But because we've got an open process, we're not preventing anyone from running. But it sends that signal, again, getting more information to the voter that this person is going to be working with the party. This person is not working with the party. I think one of the things I had heard sort of anecdotally, people voting in other primaries, the only information you really get on the primary is the name of the town that the person's from. And so sometimes that's the only information on the ballot, and people will make decisions, sometimes even on statewide races, because they haven't heard, maybe they don't watch TV, or maybe they don't, they don't get email, whatever else, is they say, oh, well, this person's from such and such. That's a more Republican town, a more Democratic, a more progressive town, and can make inferments there. And I think what would be more helpful information for voters is to say, hey, in the cases where a party would want to, they can say, here are 2 of those 3 candidates that we would that we endorse or that we would work with. Here's somebody who got on the ballot but is not going to cooperate, with the party, and allowing also the parties to decide not to do that. I think most of the time, the parties would rather keep their hands clean and not put their thumb on the scale. But in those rare cases where there's kind of a reason, to break the rule, it would give the parties some control over the brand and over the party that they're communicating to voters. 2 other things I think that would be helpful, that maybe aren't quite on the same scope of the bill, but are still general election related, is looking at cleaning up our voter rolls. I think a lot of times we've realized with COVID and sort of the universal mail out ballot, how many people are on our voter rolls that don't belong there. I purchased a house 4 years ago, and I got a ballot this year from somebody who hasn't lived there since then, and they weren't the person I bought my house from. I was talking to some of the clerks before, and it sounds like there could be up to an 8-year process from the time that we suspect somebody is not a valid voter anymore until we can actually get them removed. This used to be a problem because we didn't allow people to register after, the week before the election. But now that we have same-day voter registration, if we ever remove somebody inappropriately, we took somebody off the list before we should have, maybe they just didn't vote for 2 years for whatever reason, everyone can get back on the list and cast their ballot on election day. So to me, we had this hedge about why we didn't take people off the voter rolls too easy. And I think we've solved that problem with same-day voter registration. So I think giving town clerks and boards of civil authority, who can be a check on that town clerk, the ability to remove people who everybody in town knows that they left or whatever the case may be. Because when we reduce those voter rolls, first of all, we're spending less money mailing out ballots that don't belong places. It's even people who get those ballots and have no ill intention. It doesn't create confidence when you get a ballot mailed to your house that doesn't belong there. And so while there's no reports of anybody doing something like that, there is a confidence issue there. And when we reduce the voter rolls to make them more accurate, it actually shows that Vermont has a higher voter participation, right? If you think about voter participation being a fraction, if our denominator is too big with people who have moved out of state, if we right size that number, Vermont can report accurately our voter participation score. So we think making it easier for town clerks, going through the BCA, shortening that time frame that they can remove voter rolls. And then obviously, something that the Republican Party has always been looking for is implementing voter ID. And I think especially for same day registration. I mean, one of the issues I had is when I moved, I was on, if I had gone to the town clerk in Essex, everybody had known me there. I had won elections there before. My name was on the voter roll there. I would have voted, no problem. But 2 weeks before, I had just moved into my new house. And when I went to vote where I was supposed to vote in my new house, I walked in and was able to cast a vote that day. So I think there's still an area there where there's potential for people on same day voter registration to vote in more than one location. And we're not even requiring voter ID there. Vermont's the only state that does same day voter registration with no voter ID. So I think at least on same day registration, introducing voter ID is a good safety mechanism to make sure that that we're getting the right people voting in the right place. So that's really all I had for any prepared testimony. So I'm happy to take any questions or.
Thanks. I think you covered most of the big points, and I appreciate some of the feedback. Are there folks on the committee who have questions for Mr. Dean? Representative Byron?
How are you? No, thanks for coming in and offering the perspective. So what I wanted to circle back to was the point you raised or proposed about primary candidates within the party and getting sort of a mark of approval from the party apparatus, whatever that may be. So that would be something that would be visibly known on the primary ballot. So let's say just sort of, so I see this correctly in my head, right? 5 candidates, 2 of them a party does not find favorable, 3 of them do, the 3 would have that mark of sorts.
Yep.
Okay. And I don't know, it just at first, my first instinct sees like there could be ways that could get a little murky, right? It's like, how do people go about that? Do maybe, candidates' willingness to donate to a party apparatus maybe come into play? You know what I mean? Like it made my stomach do a couple of funny things when I started thinking about it.
Yeah.
But just for clarification, that's what you're sort of.
Well, I think giving parties the option.
Monetary, yeah.
Right. Giving parties the option to do that would allow them to really control their brand and allow, right? Because what happens, especially with, in certain cases, anybody can get on any party's ballot. There's really no prohibition, and Brooke Page has run as a Democrat for governor before. So this would be one way that the party could communicate to voters, this person isn't really playing, within the intent of the party apparatus. Because our primary system is so open, I think it's just a little bit too open, and we've got to do something to fence that in. I would see it as something that parties would probably rarely use, that there would not be any requirement for the party to endorse or approve any candidates, but that they would be able to do that through the same mechanisms that they can fill a vacancy, if somebody were to pass away or something like that.
Okay, yep. I mean, I understand how you're framing this, but thank you. Okay.
Representative Rowicki?
So with party registrations, all that?
I think it could. I'm not an advocate for party registration. I think Vermonters are independent and they like being independent. That party registration, there's games you can play with that too. What would happen is people in certain districts find that one party tends to do well, so they register in that party's primary. We see that a lot both in Massachusetts and in places like Texas where the one party is more dominant. But I'm not advocating for party registration.
Senator Burke.
Your denial at the poll same day registration scenario. Can that, this is ignorance on my part, can that only be done at the poll or at the town clerk's office, or My question basically is, does the JP have the authority to go and register somebody that can't come to the poll and just found out they were not on the rolls anymore?
So you're saying is somebody who found out on election day that they're not on the rolls and is unable to go to
Handicap.
that might be a better question for the town clerks. I'm not aware of that scenario. I think that most of the same day registration is done at the polling place. I don't know if there's been a case of somebody registering, when you send JPs. I don't know that there's any prohibition on that, but I'm not the authority on that.
We could ask Director Senning about that when he next is up to testify. All right. He's in the room, so hence the look.
Sure.
Representative Nugent.
I just wanted to clarify in terms of the verifying identity at the polls. Having been a JP for a while, what we would do is that someone could register on the same day and then they would fill out the voter information form, which does require you to give like a license number. And then after the election, the clerk would go and then verify that. And if it turned out it wasn't accurate, they would, do something about it after that. But it's not like there's no verification.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting, because in that scenario, the vote has already been placed into the ballot box. So there wouldn't be much that the JP could do about it. It's one of the reasons that when I was here before saying same day voter registration should be done on a provisional ballot. So if we did find that there was something inaccurate about a same day registration, if it was set aside in those provisional ballots, then before you give the JPs or the election officials a day or two to verify the records. And if everything's good, it gets included in with the rest of the votes. And if not, then you've already identified that vote and separated it ahead of time.
Thing I wanted to ask about is I heard you say pretty clearly in your testimony in response to the sore loser proposal that's in the draft language about kind of the strong feeling that to have integrity, you got to stay in your lane. You pick whether you're going to be an I or a D or an R or a P at the beginning and follow that all the way through. And
at least for that election. Next election, you can change your mind.
I wanted to contrast that a little bit against your testimony around the sort of dual nominations. Because I've wrestled with this a lot in deciding what to present to the committee to solve, especially the issue, which we'll hear more about tomorrow, around a relatively small number of write-ins. If there's an open party candidate in like a county election, for instance, you can grab that nod and there's no way for the local party to say that candidate, they got some of their friends to grab our ballot, but they're not with us. Like we don't want our brand, to use your language. So how would you feel about some mechanism, perhaps other than endorsement, like raising the threshold of the percentage of write-in votes that you need to get, or to have some check-in from parties where they'd have some say if the person hadn't filed and they won that write-in nod?
Yeah. I mean, that was sort of another angle that I had toyed with, sort of as a contrast to the kind of approval process, is allowing, giving parties some kind of discretion to either, remove names or require something from the candidate, some kind of engagement with the party and the candidate to getting their name on there. The reason I didn't sort of lead with that is I feel like there's a lot more unintended problems with that. And we maybe moved back too far towards that sort of smoke-filled room, a lack of transparency there, where, a party can tell somebody you can't run, or we're not going to endorse you, or we're not going to let you have the party label. But I think if you gave parties some kind of mechanism to, I guess as I had always thought of it, it would be at the beginning of the primary process, allowing the parties to say this person, right? We could do an inverse of that, saying this person doesn't meet party standards for something. I don't know if it quite addresses the fact that after they've won the primary because they got enough write-in votes, that to me seems to be a little stickier situation because they've already won the election. And how do you eliminate sort of nefarious actors and still encourage genuine kind of grassroots engagement? It's one of those things where you're gonna make an error somewhere, and if you're gonna make that error, I would rather make the error that includes greater participation from people who maybe haven't understood the process before. But I think, creating some kind of mechanism where the party gets a check after the primary, I don't know what that would look like, but that's something I could see myself supporting with some details.
Well, I'd love to encourage the committee to think about this particular issue. Has been on my mind since last August, and we're going to hear some testimony tomorrow morning about this very thing. So that threshold issue of if you're already on one party's line, what should it really take to get the other major party nominations, I think is a key fundamental question that I wanted this committee to look at in putting this bill. And so I really, really appreciate you being here, Chair Dame. I know, we're from opposite parties, and you've really done a thoughtful job of responding to some of the things we put on the table, and I really welcome that feedback. Thank you for being here today.
Well, glad to do it. Thank you.
Okay. So next up, I believe Mr. Wronski is here, the Executive Director of the Vermont Progressive Party. Josh, welcome to House Gov.Ops.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. So my name is Josh Wronski. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Progressive Party. I've been in this position since 2016. So I've been through a few election cycles at this point. So I'll just get right into it. We don't have a decent number of the proposal we don't have strong feelings about. So I really want to focus on a few key areas, one of which being the elimination of candidates to run as fusion candidates, either D/R, RD, PD, PDR, whatever. We've had all combinations of fusion candidates in Vermont. So just, a few quick facts on fusion voting and how it kind of operates in reality, at least in the past election. So in 2022, there were a total of 69 fusion candidates that ran in Vermont, and 8 of them were P/D, 10 were D/P, 16 were D/R, and 30 were R/D, and then another 5 were R and Libertarian. So 69, majority of those are not Progressive Party candidates. I'm just kind of saying that to, show this is something used by all political parties. So fusion is really popular among Vermonters. Of the 69 candidates who ran using fusion, I believe 60 of them actually won, including 7 P/Ds, 8 D/Ps, 16 D/Rs, and 29 R/Ds. A large number of those are in the county level. So 32 were county, there were 2 statewide, 18 fusion candidates, 1 in the Vermont House, and 8 fusion candidates, I believe, in the Vermont Senate. So this is something that, it's being used on every single level of government, from the county to state and statewide office by all different political parties. And it's been, fairly popular. Vermonters like it. And I think a major reason why Vermonters like fusion voting is because they appreciate when the parties can actually work together and collaborate on a candidate. I think we see so much vitriol at the national level and even in Vermont that when the political parties get behind the same candidate in certain races, Vermonters do appreciate that. And I think that's not a bad thing. We're not the only state that uses fusion voting. There are 8 states in total. The biggest one of the biggest being New York State, which has a long history of fusion voting. They do it a little bit different than us, rather than having a R/D or P/D on the ballot. They have different ballot lines. So there are different ways, if there was interest in reforming how fusion voting operates, there are different ways that, we could do that. But in general, we are very opposed to the idea of eliminating a candidate's ability to run with 2 different party labels. Vermont, yeah, has a long tradition of allowing open affiliation with whatever political party you choose. And it really feels like, I heard my colleague on the Republican Party talk about how it's good for voters to have more information, and fusion voting is a really good way to do that. What better way for a voter to understand where someone's values lie than by actually having those multiple party labels on the ballot? Like if you're running as a P/D, there's a very clear understanding that, you have the support of both progressives and Democrats, and you lean more towards the progressive side of the spectrum ideologically. If you're running as an R/D or a D/R, it's good for voters to know that both Republicans and Democrats are supporting your candidacy, and you're running more to the center potentially, and maybe you're a bridge builder between those two parties. So, it really doesn't feel like something that that there's a problem that we should be looking to address. It feels like this is something that has worked very well in Vermont, and it should be continued. So moving on to some of the idea that we're going to eliminate, as it's often referred to, the second bite at the apple or the sore loser provision. We also disagree with that. I would wonder how many times that has actually happened in recent memory in Vermont. I don't think it's a very common instance, and generally the Progressive Party, we discourage folks.
Yeah.
I'll just say it happened to you
Yes.
or against me.
Okay. So it doesn't happen very frequently, although it does happen. Generally, at least speaking for the Progressive Party, we discourage folks within our party from doing that, because generally if you do lose a Democratic or progressive primary, you're not likely to then go on and win the general. At the same time, I would point out the fact that Vermont has a huge issue with uncontested races, right? So I believe about a third of all races in Vermont in the past election were uncontested. And that's a huge problem, right? And this has a potential to actually make that worse, right? So if we're saying that you can't run in the general election if you lost the nomination of one political party, that's eliminating more people from being able to run on the general election ballot. And with so many uncontested races, I think really we should be looking at ways to expand the ability of people to get on the ballot and make that easier, and not make it more challenging for people to get on the ballot. The same thing is true with the restrictions to the write-in campaigns. It just feels like it's a weakening of the democratic process and further cutting down ability of writing candidates to actually get on the ballot. And as my Republican colleague said, we have a long, proud tradition of counting every vote in Vermont, and I think that's really a good thing. If someone is going out and putting their name down, putting a name of a candidate down as a writing candidate, that vote should be counted, and we should have a good sense of, how many write-in votes and who those write-in votes are for. Because even if they're really unlikely to get elected, and I do understand it is a lot of extra work for the town clerks, and I appreciate that, it is important for voters to see where those write-in votes are going. Just the last piece I would comment on, the idea that we're going to eliminate the campaign contribution limits for candidates between candidates and political parties. I don't think that's a good thing that we should be supporting. Vermonters in general, I believe, want us to get more money out of politics. And there are already ways for candidates to, if you're done running for office and you want to donate the money, you can already donate that money to charity or other ways. And we shouldn't be creating more avenues to funnel money into the political system and avoid campaign contribution limits. We should be looking at ways to lessen the amount of money in our political system. Those are some of the key points on the actual bill. And I would say, there are a lot of issues with our current system and there are reforms that we would support and we think that are really valuable for this committee and others to look into. Those include systems such as ranked choice voting, which would expand, our democratic and enhance our democratic system. We could look at what other states have done in terms of creating a unified primary system. That's an interesting model that's worth exploring. And we should also be looking at public financing of elections. So those are all the types of reforms that we support, or at least support exploring. But yeah, eliminating fusion voting and eliminating second bite of the apple, we do not support at all. And that's all I have for my testimony. Happy to answer questions. What's happening?
Senator Cooper.
Josh, thanks for coming. Could you give us a rundown on the unified primary system and what that looks like?
Yeah, so the unified primary system, and this isn't like a statement of support. It's just something I think is worth looking at. So basically you have a single primary and every political party candidate runs. So there could be like 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, 3 progressives, for one seat, all on that same primary election ballot. And then the top 2.
Independents in that case?
I believe it probably depends on how it's actually structured, how the law is structured. Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm unsure. And it would probably depend on like how the law would be written here, whether you want to include independents or not. But the idea is then you're narrowing it down to 2 candidates from that primary ballot. So you could end up with, in a very conservative district, you could end up with 2 Republicans in the general election, or you could end up with a Democrat and a Republican, or a Republican and a progressive. So it's a way to kind of, have everyone on the same ballot initially, and then it moves on to a second round, essentially.
Representative Byron.
So in last election cycle's primary 2022, how many standalone ballots were cast for progressive candidates?
Are you talking about in the primary? I'm actually not sure. I don't have those numbers on me right now. I'm sorry about that.
No.
Yeah, it's easily accessible on the, Secretary of State's.
Yeah. Because we did see them. I don't remember exactly what it was. I remember being a little surprised at how actually low that number was as a comparative. So if hybrid candidates were no longer allowed moving forward, do you think that would actually build up voter enthusiasm for a straight P candidate instead of a hybrid going on to a Democratic Party candidate? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think
there's a lot of commingling there.
There is, and I think it's on all sides, right? So we hear all the time, Republicans are.
More frequently with the P's and the D's.
I would push back on that a little bit. I think, we saw in the Chittenden County State's Attorney's race in Chittenden County, a lot of Republicans voting in the Democratic primary to vote for Sarah Fair George's opponent, right? And that's, potentially thousands of people, or at least hundreds and hundreds of people. We see that in gubernatorial races. How many votes did Phil Scott get on the Democratic, write-in votes did Phil Scott get in the Democratic primary? And I'm sure some of those are Democrats, but I think a lot of Republicans, if they see a contested race in the Democratic primary for their district, they do choose to pull the Democratic ballot. So we have an open primary system exactly because we want to give voters the choice every election in which primary they want to vote in. And that happens all the time. And yes, certainly there are progressives who go vote in the Democratic primary, but you're allowed to do that in Vermont. And I think that's part of our political tradition, and that's a very good thing. Would that shift if we ended fusion voting? I think certainly there would be more people voting in the progressive primary, as there would probably be more people voting in the Republican primary as well if they had to people had to choose in the same election. But yeah, and we may very well have more three-way races on the statewide level and the House level. I think that's certainly a possibility as well. But yeah, I don't think that's the direction that Vermonters want us to go. I think we want to continue this tradition of allowing the political parties to work together on candidates when those candidates choose to.
Josh, do you think that, so I think one of the key things you said that struck my ear was this idea of providing information to voters. And I don't know how we would do this, but do you think it would resolve some of the concern that folks who support eliminating the fusion voting, if there was a clear indication, for instance, in the legislative level of who are you going to caucus with, or do you have a party's endorsement? Because one of the things I've struggled with as we've considered these policies and we considered, making modifications of primaries over the years is I do really care about the integrity of what it says on that ballot and what it's communicating to voters. And with our system being as open as it is, where a county candidate can get a couple hundred votes and get a party's endorsement that they have no connection to, like, do you think there's any mechanism that your party or you would support to clarify for folks who really is affiliated with a party as opposed to just happening to get a small number of write-ins on an open line?
Yeah, and I think a little bit of that is on the party. Like we have that issue all the time, right? Like, you know, it's no secret that as a political party, we don't run candidates in most races, and that's intentional because we are the smallest of the major parties at this point. And we run races strategically where we feel like we want to focus our energy, and that does create openings like in both statewide and, you know, local races for candidates to do exactly what you're saying, who, you know, have no affiliation with us to win those write-in votes. And, you know, political parties can address that by running candidates in those races. Even, you know, they can run and then withdraw. That's like one option that parties have, and that does happen all the time. I believe the Republicans did that for most of their statewide races, or many of their statewide races in the last election. So a little bit of that is kind of, I think, could be on the political party kind of to fight that, and it's on them to kind of organize in those communities where they're worried about that. You know, raising the write-in threshold, I think, I haven't thought about that fully, but that's something that might, you know, be worth looking into. And again, I would also look at how many times has this actually happened. And I know there are a few like high profile cases from this past election. But yeah, I would really want us to think about how frequently is that an issue versus, you know, is it just one or two high profile instances that we're looking to change the entire kind of election system around?
Representative Hooper.
Mr. Chair, do you mind if we explore some hypotheticals with some historical context?
So just keep in mind, we have one more witness on this topic, and we're going to take a break and then switch gears. So if it's more something, if you have specific questions for Mr. Wronski and the Progressive Party's position on the bill, I'd say let's do that now. If you want to throw some things on the table, we'll have time to have lots of committee discussion on this bill because we'll be working on it for a while.
I abstain.
Okay, totally. I really appreciate that. I don't want to stifle things. I just want to make sure we're asking the questions and discussing things at the right time. Great. Well, any final questions for Mr. Wronski? Great. Thank you so much for being here, Josh.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate the opportunity, and good luck with your work.
And our last witness on this topic today is Paul Burns, who's the executive director at VPIRG. And Paul, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Paul Burns. I'm the executive director of VPIRG, which is the Vermont Public Interest Research Group. And it's a pleasure to be here. I have had an opportunity many times over the last 22 years that I've been doing this work for VPIRG to address this committee. As the committee members may know, VPIRG works on a broad range of issues, from environment to democracy to healthcare to consumer protection, et cetera. And democracy, kind of writ large, is one of the areas where I am chiefly involved as one of the advocates for the organization. And I do have a long history here. So again, a pleasure to be here. Since it is my first time before the committee this year, I want to just provide a brief context, and I want to make sure I get it right. So I'm going to read some of this. I have been the executive director of VPIRG again for more than 22 years. VPIRG itself has operated as a 501c4 nonprofit in Vermont for 51 years. Since 1975, we have also had a 501c3 charitable nonprofit organization called Vermont Public Interest Research and Education Fund. And in the last several years, we became active in candidate elections for the first time, launching VPIRG Votes and VPIRG Votes Action Fund, a coordinated political committee and an independent expenditure committee, respectively. In my testimony today, I will be representing VPIRG, the advocacy arm with which you are no doubt most familiar. I will note for the record that VPIRG has long been involved in policy matters related to democratic reform, including campaign finance disclosure, lobbying, ranked choice voting, and various measures that have helped to make it easier for people in this state to vote. And today I'm obviously focusing on the miscellaneous elections bill before you. And broadly, I would say that there are parts of the bill that VPIRG supports, parts that we oppose, other parts that we don't have any formal position on. And I know the time is brief, and so I'd be happy to come back if that's helpful to you. But let me just kind of run through some of the top lines. We support the provision in Section 8, allowing for the voluntary filing and collection of candidates' demographic information. We believe this is important so Vermont can better track how we're doing as a state when it comes to having people in office who provide fair representation for the state as a whole. We believe that it's valuable to have various perspectives helping to shape the debate and decide the policy on lots of different issues and priorities. Collecting these data will allow the state, individuals, organizations, and candidates to assess where we are and what improvements might be made. The fact that the data collection is voluntary, I think, should help to resolve or remove any concerns about privacy. VPIRG also supports some of the provisions that deal with writing candidates. Specifically, I think serious writing candidates should not be dissuaded by the requirement to file with appropriate state or local officials in the days leading up to an election. Such a requirement eases the burden on local election officials. Lord knows that would be a good thing. And I think where less serious writing candidates, this would be the case where less serious writing candidates have almost no chance of winning. There are other aspects of the write-in policy which we are not taking a kind of a formal position on today. I'd be happy to kind of think about it and provide more information later if that's helpful. But there are two significant provisions of the bill, however, that VPIRG opposes. The first is Section 6 relating to the cross nominations. It's our position that voters benefit from the opportunity to see all candidate party endorsements that a candidate receives. Cross nominations may tell us something useful and important about the candidate and their beliefs. Conversely, we see no value in denying voters a chance to see that a candidate has received the nomination of multiple parties. We don't believe that this is a problem that needs to be fixed. And indeed, it was mentioned there are opportunities even to strengthen fusion voting. I come from New York State originally, and I will just say that my father was a local elected official for 22 years, a county legislator there. His districts were about the size of yours with 4,000 plus constituents. He first ran for office as a Democrat, but was cross-endorsed by the Conservative Party. And he had a lot of friends in our small town who assured him they would never have voted for him on the Democratic line, but because they could vote for him on a separate line as a conservative, he ultimately won that election. And he served primarily as a Democrat for 11 years and then switched to a Republican. So my background is very bi or tripartisan in that respect, I guess, from the family history. But I'm not really proposing that you move that direction on fusion voting here, but that's what New York has, is your name is literally listed multiple times for each political party where you have an endorsement. And that does give, I think, voters an option that they otherwise do not have, gives them that freedom. I mean, we can criticize, but some voters feel very strong. I'm never going to pull the lever under this political party, but I would under another. So it kind of frees them up to vote for a candidate if they receive multiple party endorsements. And it gives those tend to be smaller political parties a little bit more credibility and power in an election process as well by getting involved in a race like that. Can tip the balance and has in states like New York or Connecticut and others. Moving then to the question of campaign finance in this bill. This is the provision that would allow candidates to give unlimited contributions to political parties. We have been very active on campaign finance issues for decades. Our belief is that elections and races are not benefited by allowing for unlimited contributions from any source. In fact, we think the opposite is true. Unlimited contributions or expenditures from very wealthy individuals, candidates, parties, or corporations tend to have a corrupting influence over the process. I was at the U.S. Supreme Court in February of 2006 when the Vermont case on campaign finance reform was heard before the U.S. Supreme Court. It was kind of a proud moment. VPERG had played a role in passing that law to begin with in 1997 here. And you may recall that law set strict limits on campaign contributions, $200 to state rep candidates, $300 for Senate candidates, and $400 for statewide candidates. Quaint, I guess, today, but those were the limits that went to the Supreme Court. And that law also passed with an absolute limit on what candidates could spend in their races. That was intentionally, you could say, constitutionally provocative because of the Buckley v. Vallejo decision that had come down in 1976, essentially saying money equals speech and you can't limit what candidates spend in their races. However, I would point out that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, just below the U.S. Supreme Court, upheld Vermont's provisions on both contributions and on that expenditure limit. And had the U.S. Supreme Court makeup been a little bit different, for instance, had the 2000 election been decided a little bit differently in the state of Florida, we maybe wouldn't have lost that on a 6-3 Supreme Court decision and perhaps would have prevailed there.
Paul, I hesitate to interrupt your testimony, but I just want to ask you a question on this specific thing. And I held off from asking Mr. Wronski when he characterized this provision in a similar way. I supported putting this suggestion into this bill because I believe that in a post-Citizens United world, the most transparent way that we keep track of who's spending money on what is to have candidates raise money, report who's getting those contributions, and then if they want to work with their party to help get themselves elected, hire staff, et cetera, they should be able to freely do that as long as it's totally transparent how they're spending. That's why I supported this increase just from candidates to their parties so that there is transparency, because the reality in a post-Citizens United world is there are lots of ways that you can get the money there, but they're the least transparent ways. So I'm wondering if you could just respond to that version of the framing of why that provision's in the bill.
The Supreme Court has made it probably difficult to achieve a lot of the aims that I'm guessing we may share, or the values that we would like to see in elections. I grant that that is absolutely the case. So the question has often come down to, well, maybe is transparency the way to go, and just have greater transparency and no limits on contributions and expenditures. And we have maintained the belief that that is not the way to go, to move away from reasonable limits on contributions. And you could look at reasons why. Why do people give to candidates? So I think most people give so that they can help that candidate get elected to office, not necessarily so that that candidate can turn around and use that money for some other purpose, even backing up the political party that candidate happens to belong to. So you can ask, is that the right way to allow for that kind of money to flow through the system? We are, in a sense, allowing our laws to be circumvented by if we were to allow candidates to make unlimited contributions. I think the idea of unlimited is also giving me and perhaps others pause here. And is that really necessary? I mean, how many candidates can we imagine who are going to make a contribution of $1 million to a political party here? And yet one could with this kind of thing. Perhaps a retiring U.S. senator might decide that he or she wanted to make that kind of a contribution to a party. And I don't think that would be fair. I mean, I don't think that really is what was intended by the people who made those contributions to that candidate. And I don't think that's really fair for our election system here, that one party could be advantaged in that massive way by the decision of one individual who happened to use the wealth that they accumulated by receiving these contributions.
So that scenario that you talked about is current law today for senators, members of Congress that are elected from Vermont. They can make those contributions unlimited. And the proposal we have before us is to say statewide candidates for governor, secretary of state, et cetera, could also do that.
Yeah.
Would VPERG feel more inclined to support or be neutral if we came up with some reasonable threshold? Because $10,000 in the modern era is it's absurdly small. It asks statewide candidates to get PACs to contribute on their behalf. And that is the least transparent way to run an election. And $10,000 for a statewide race from their campaign to a party doesn't allow for hardly any collaboration. I mean, it wouldn't pay one fraction of one staff person's salary, for instance. So that's just the kind of thing I'm wrestling with this bill is how do we, have some reasonable way for a statewide candidate to coordinate with the party without having an end run around our transparency system.
Yeah, and to be clear, we don't support the idea that the federal candidates can spend their money that way. Clear, but I understand. I mean, unlimited is particularly problematic. If we're talking about something else, then yes, we can have some conversation about that. We have, so probably enough said there, but I'd be happy to revisit. We have commented on these laws. We commented on 10,000. We commented on all the others that are in place now. These are aspects of Vermont law that we have been rather involved in over the years. So would be happy to engage in further conversation. Representative, thank you. In any case, if you have never been to the U.S. Supreme Court, I encourage you to go. It is democracy in action. And even if you don't win the case, it is an awesome thing to see and observe. And to be there as Vermont's campaign finance law was debated in front of the Supreme Court was a really special experience. It happened that Anna Nicole Smith was there on the same day having her case argued, and that's another story. Those are the chief provisions that in this bill. There are others that we really don't have an organizational position on. I know they're of keen interest to this committee, and you've received some other testimony and consideration there. They're just not things that VPIRG itself has weighed in on at this point. I would say that in terms of other ways of looking at these elections and how they might move forward, I encourage the committee to be open to ideas like banning corporate contributions, direct corporate contributions to candidates. This is something that we have been supporting for years. The Senate has passed that legislation a few times. We hope that it will be taken up again this year. As part of that bill, they've also looked at ways to improve our public financing system, which is on the books today, but it is not really an effective or usable system for those who are serious candidates for, if they intend to get elected. Why do we keep a law on the books that is like that? I mean, it maybe make us feel good that we've got public financing, but if it's not real, I don't think that's a good thing. And so we encourage you to consider ways to change that. There are ideas like democracy dollars that has been used in a couple of elections in Seattle that we are particularly supportive of, and that was listed specifically in previous legislation that was passed by the Senate. I think we support ranked choice voting. We're very active in the Burlington town meeting day, there'll be a proposal to expand ranked choice voting there. It'll also be used in all district city council races in Burlington, and was used effectively in the December 6th special election for a city council race in Burlington. Went really well. Would love to come back and talk more about that at some point. Ranked choice voting has also been paired with something similar to what Mr. Ronski spoke of earlier, which is a kind of a winnowing of the field in the primary. And there's something called Final Four or Final Five policies that are in place in other places. So, for instance, some of you may have watched Alaska. The special election for the congressional seat in Alaska got a lot of attention because both Sarah Palin and Santa Claus were running in that race. And it was ultimately won by a Democrat. But the way they run the primary there is that you can be of any political party, or I believe independent candidates as well. And the top four move on to the general election. Whatever party, it could be 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, whatever mix, et cetera. And then that general election is decided on a ranked choice voting ballot. And so you choose those candidates, and you can rank them 1 to 4, or choose not to if that's your preference. But that's the way the Alaska special election and the general election were held. And that is how Senator Murkowski was also reelected, a relatively moderate Republican. And there was concern that there was no way she's going to win a Republican primary in Alaska anymore unless it had an open process like this. And that is one of the reasons why Alaska moved forward, a fairly red state in terms of national politics, and adopted ranked choice voting to allow for a more moderate candidate, giving that more moderate candidate the possibility of moving forward in the election. So I just encourage you to think about that. There are other ways of going forward, and we support, as a kind of a first step in this field, simply using ranked choice voting for the next presidential primary here, which would be obviously next year in 2024. A half dozen or so states are already using ranked choice voting in the presidential primary. And there, the key incentive, I think, is that by the time the primary takes place in Vermont, we now have mail-in voting that many people use. But if you vote early, a good chance well, it's not uncommon for the candidate you supported it when you sent your ballot in is no longer in the race by the time our primary takes place. And thousands of Vermonters have been disenfranchised or their votes have been wasted when a candidate has dropped out before the primary even takes place here in case of the presidential. And I think that's one of the most important reasons to consider ranked choice in that situation. I know that's not what you're considering as part of this. So
I will just say while we're on it that I know Senator Hardy's our counterpart is taking a lot of testimony on ranked choice voting. I imagine that we'll have a charter change bill from Burlington if that measure to expand the RCV there passes. So that is a topic that I would encourage the committee to start doing your reading on, because there's a lot to it. And I know that VPIRG is a big advocate for it. I'm sure we will be talking about RCV later in the session.
Look forward to it. Thank you. And thanks very much for the opportunity to provide testimony. I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Questions for Paul? Really? I was the only one?
Yeah.
Representative.
Paul, in an ideal world, how soon would we adopt ranked choice voting outright?
I think there are probably steps that we would take as a state. So again, I think giving voters statewide the opportunity to try out ranked choice voting on a ballot where it's the only thing on the ballot for the presidential primary has real merit. There's no confusion there for the voters that there's multiple offices, some with ranked choice, some without. So I think getting a chance to try that out in a presidential primary where, again, a number of states have done it. We're not inventing the wheel here. We can look to how they have done it and participate in broad public education around it in that instance as well. I think from there, we would probably look at the federal races here, U.S. Congress and U.S. Senate. There are no issues about constitutionality for those offices. They exist now. Maine, for instance, has used it. Alaska, as I mentioned, and other states are looking at that as well. And so I think that could happen. You could look at that in 2026 or something like that. But then I think you move forward. There are other questions, I will say, with respect to statewide offices. I think it would make a lot of sense for a governor and lieutenant governor here, where we have, with all due respect, a very undemocratic process. If a candidate running for governor receives less than 50%, it goes to all of you to decide on a secret ballot who our governor is.
Right.
That's unusual and not very democratic, to be perfectly honest. And the last time that happened in a gubernatorial race, there were nearly 70 legislators who voted for the second place finisher in that case. And again, well, I'll just say, I don't think that's the best process. I would love to see this, but there are constitutional questions there that would need to be addressed or figured out. We think it would be constitutional. Others take a different opinion about that because of the way that our specific constitutional language says it goes to the legislature if nobody gets 50%.
Overall, you endorse an incremental approach.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And that's exactly kind of the path that we're on with Burlington, this largest city, using it, implementing it, and moving to expand it, potentially for presidential primaries and then federal, and then we'll see.
I think we will definitely be having you back, Mr. Burns. So thank you very much for bringing the perspective to our bill. We're going to have Representative Bloomley in just a bit. So I want to give